Well, hello everyone. I've got a really special guest with me today. I'm so excited. Welcome, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Lovely to see you. Thank you ever so much for giving me your time. How are things with you?
Things are holding steady, Catherine. How
Good.
about yourself?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, under the circumstances, I'm actually pretty positive about things as they go, moving forward. But yeah, I'm trying to remain positive, and it looks like the media are tripping themselves a lot at the moment, is waking a lot of people up, which is brilliant. It's fantastic. But before we go on, if you just mind giving my viewers your credentials.
Oh, yeah, sure, Catherine. I am a physician, a medical doctor. I did my training in forensic psychiatry, and that's what I specialized. Earlier in my career, I worked as a physician assistant in oncology. And then previously to that, I did research in public health for the CDC and the New York Health Department, and also in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. So I kind of have a lot of different experiences in healthcare and medicine. And in my forensic work, I did a lot of sort of investigative work, like I was asked to be maybe an expert witness or a consultant for some kind of legal or administrative matter. And then I was given mountains of records to go through and find bits of evidence, that would support an opinion about an important question, like, okay, could someone's suicide have been prevented, or was someone legally insane at the time they murdered someone else, questions like that. But that kind of thinking, I think, really helped prepare me to investigate and, uncover some of the fundamental truths or misconceptions underlying the pandemic situation.
Yeah, fantastic. So, misconception, I like that word. We're just going forward now because I just thought I'll get straight into this because from my point of view and yours, I think the whole thing really boils down to the isolation of this so-called virus because in my opinion, without the isolation and purification and even detecting it at this point, how can we even move forward from that? As far as I was aware, looking into viruses, there's the Koch postulates that can be used. Obviously, if the first one falls, then all three will fall anyway. It doesn't apply to any of those. But even is it the density gradient centrifuge as well, that isolation technique? And I've looked at studies, I've read them, and as far as I can see, I can't see anywhere where any of this has even taken place for SARS-CoV-2, what they call it, or even SARS-CoV-1, but SARS-CoV-2. What's your professional opinion on that, Doctor?
Well, Catherine, you certainly brought up a lot of important points there. It's clear that you've done a lot of research. I try to look at the overall picture as being sort of levels of knowledge or information. And, really you can look at any area of science like this. And my approach was to look at things, at the surface level. So when I was practicing medicine, conventional allopathic medicine, I observed what happened with the patients that I was treating. And these were mostly, people with like depression or anxiety or manic episodes or psychosis. And I was, told to treat them with various different medications. And in observing what happened is I saw that in almost every case, the person didn't improve or they didn't they didn't respond. Certainly there were no cures. So, but that was at a very high level. It didn't have anything to do with what is mental illness at the underlying level. But so I started there and then I drilled down, layer by layer, and this unfolded for me in a very organic way over a period of years. But what I did find is that the deeper I got, I found that there were fundamental flaws in what we've been taught. In fact, in many cases, what the prevailing theory is actually the opposite of what is most likely to be the truth. So when this pandemic started to make waves in China and internationally, and I saw people at the San Francisco airport wearing face masks in February, I said, all right, I need to drill down to the basic level, because all of the information that you're told, like how many, people are infected or dying of this, or what the illness is, or all of the policies, they're all have to be based on a fundamental piece of information, right? Which is they tell us that there is a virus and it causes this new illness. But if that's not really true, then everything that's built on it just crumbles down like a house of cards. Whereas if you just look at, okay, some obvious things at the superficial level, like, why aren't there any excess deaths as a result of a worldwide public health crisis? Then that leads you to ask many more questions, but it doesn't really tell you what's at the root of the whole issue. And then if another virus comes along, or they say that this one is mutated and then more people die, you will then take it seriously and think that it's a real virus if you didn't look and drill down to that basic level of information. So when I decided to do this, I pulled up the papers where they have claimed to, isolated, that's the word they use, isolate. I'll put that in quotations because they have created a different definition of that word. But they use that word, and it's commonly misconceived to mean they actually separated it from other things and had it by itself. I was just astonished to find what they had done in their experiments, because it didn't prove anything. So in other words, they never pulled fluid out of a sick person and then separated the virus out of that and said, here's the virus. That's never been done. Instead, they do this crazy procedure where they put the body fluid in with a bunch of toxic chemicals and some foreign cells, and then they show those cells dying and they say, oh, there's the virus. It's totally crazy. So when I drilled down to the other experiments they did, like how they determined the testing sequences for the PCR, and when they claimed that they sequenced the whole genome of the virus, and then even when they claimed to satisfy Koch's postulates, which is the simple set of common sense rules when how you prove that a germ causes an illness. And all you do is you take the germ out of someone who's sick and then put it in someone who's healthy or a healthy animal, and then they get the same disease. Very simple to do. And there are articles saying that they've done all these things, but when you actually read the experiments, you see that they did no such thing. In fact, not even close to the thing. In some cases, at every single level that they claim to show evidence of something, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's, and they don't apply any statistical analysis many times. They don't do any control experiments. So it's basically some of the worst quality science I've seen. Like if you put this experiment into, like an introductory lab course, at MIT in science, unless the professor was a virologist, they would say, what the heck is this? There's no control experiment. You can't prove what you say by the methods. It was really, really shoddy science. And so that's really what I uncovered. And so everything else, has to be false because it's based on that false construct.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I feel about it as well. Nothing can come from something that isn't there in essence. And it's the same sort of thing when I was looking into how even just the basics of virology and how it's all kind of based on a flawed theory. And then, you realize how deep it goes in terms of, well, why aren't any virologists talking? Well, there are some that talk about it, as we know. But, you realize how deep the net is in terms of who's controlling the funding. And, you sort of just get used to misinterpreting something and then just carrying that forward. Because essentially, what they're doing is they're misinterpreting what they're seeing when they try and take the virus out of the body, because through my research, when it's inside the body, it's there specifically for a reason. It can call upon upon other bacteria and microbes, and the cells are talking to each other like Rice discovered.
Catherine, before you get into that, you have to first specify what's the it you're talking about that does those things.
Yeah.
Right? Because, so, the word virus itself means poison
And
from the
yeah.
Latin, right? Now, and that was the way it was used in virus theory until really the 1950s. That's the first time that they thought about that it could be an organism with its own genetics, because at that time there was the DNA double helix had been reported, and there was all kinds of new thinking about the role of genetics in biology. Um, so I'm not sure what you're talking about there, but in terms of like, have they ever shown a microscopic particle that they call a virus to actually come from people with an illness and then demonstrate experimentally that it causes that illness? They've actually never done those experiments successfully with any virus that they say causes disease. So it's really important when you're talking about this stuff to be very clear about what you're saying, because I find that even with the people with the most expertise, like it's really confusing when you use the word virus. What are you referring to exactly? And same thing with other terms, like even germ. The word germ really refers to new growth, new life, budding things, right? And that's why you call like germ cells are the cells that make new life, like the sperm cells and the egg cells.
Yeah.
And so you kind of invert the meaning of germ to say that it's a microorganism that invades and causes disease.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of important obfuscation, I think, with these words, and it's very tricky to navigate.
Yeah. So, say going back to that, then, would you say when you say exosomes, what are you referring to with that? Can you tell the viewers what you're actually talking about, and what an exosome actually does, what its purpose is in the body?
Right. Well, exosomes were, discovered somewhere around 30 years ago, and essentially they're the same as they say the viral particles are, in size and appearance and in what they contain, in that they contain genetic material. And there's a whole field of biology that does exosome research, and it's very closely related to virus research. And in fact, there's some crossover of scientists, and there are several scientists who, in their papers, have compared viruses and exosomes, even saying that they're the same thing in some cases. But what they say the exosome is that it's basically a particle that comes off of our own cells. In other words, it's a human product. Okay, so it's not, any other organism, or it doesn't come from anywhere else, but it's a piece of our own body. And essentially what they're theorized to be, and it's not conclusively known by anyone the true role of exosomes, but what they think they are basically packets of information. So just imagine, having a parcel that has a letter in it, right, or a secret code maybe, and you put that in the package, and on the package you write an address label, and the address label would be like the receptor of an exosome, and it targets it to another part of your body. Like, let's say that you accidentally eat poisonous mushrooms. Okay, so they start to damage the cells in your intestine, let's say theoretically, and then your intestine makes exosomes, which are just small little bits of its membrane that pinch off into little like water balloons, but they put some RNA or DNA inside there, that's the code of information.
Yeah.
And then there's a receptor, which is like the address label, and let's say it targets it to the liver, right? And it tells the liver, okay, make a lot of glutathione or other liver enzymes to basically neutralize the poison from the mushrooms, right? So that would be, now that's not an experiment, I made that up, but that would be theoretically how they would work, right? So they send information. And they have done very good research on exosomes. Like, for example, what I described that you would do with a virus, where you take it out of the body fluid and then, separate it and show you just have this virus. Well, with exosomes, they do that. In fact, you can find papers that just describe techniques on how to purify exosomes out of body fluids. And they're usually based on what they call ultracentrifugation, which is, a centrifuge. Everybody's familiar with that. It just spins around. Well, they usually use a density gradient, which is just a liquid with things of different density, and then the particles or exosomes would separate a specific way. But they also use even fancier molecular techniques like flow cytometry, where they would know what receptor is on the exosome, that address label, and they would basically put the lock and key to that address label, and use that to separate out the things that had that address label only.
Wow.
So very sophisticated, and you can find lots of papers where they took exosomes out of a body fluid and purified them out, showed them under the electron microscope, where everything you see there is a uniform particle that looks identical. And then they can actually characterize the proteins and other molecules that make up the membrane and what's inside. And they can take out the genetic material and know that they got it from that particle, and then sequence it. And so, like, I saw one study where they did this and they found that it had ribosomal RNA in it, which is, from the mechanism that makes proteins. Right? And that information was contained inside an exosome. So with exosomes, they've done like the real experiments.
Yeah, they've done the real science. Yeah.
Right, and shown it to be a real thing.
Yeah.
So this is the standard of experiment, that they could do the same thing,
Yeah.
with viruses. But the thing is, what I think the real reason is because there simply are no viruses. So if they tried to use these techniques, and by the way, they did use these techniques back in the 40s and early 50s, and they were never successful at isolating a particle that was uniform. So, really we have no prima facie evidence of the existence of these viral particles.
Yeah, this is something I noticed as well when I was researching polio a long time ago. So in terms of, the isolation, there is no isolation of virus. With the PCR testing.
Well, let me just make one more point about exosomes, if I may.
Yeah,
because what I really observed about exosomes initially that I think was important is that when they do those so-called isolation experiments where they have that toxic cell culture, they show the dying cells. And when cells die, one of the things they do is they make lots of exosomes. And it's like, think of it as like a distress signal, right? And so when they show little particles under the microscope mixed up with all these cells in the culture, like nothing's purified out, how do you know they're not just showing exosomes? Because we know exosomes would be there. We know they look identical to the virus.
And we know they exist. They would
make
sense,
exactly.
Right?
So you'd have to account for them. Like, you'd have to, at a minimum, ask that microscopist, say, okay, you're pointing to this particle as being a virus. Where are the exosomes? Show me those. Like, put arrows for those. And then show me how they're different. Right? And how you can prove that, or where's the experimental proof of that, with a chemical test or some other test that could back it up or is more definitive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, that's what's missing.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. It makes total sense to me. Yeah, so, the whole thing that's driving this is, no doubt about it, is the PCR test, which, Carrie Mullis obviously invented a long time ago and knew how it was being misinterpreted, not misused, because as an amplification tool, it will amplify whatever it sees. But in terms of, what they're actually looking at and what is being amplified in this test, which is, driving these false positives up, people who are asymptomatic or just healthy people are testing positive, which is then justifying our lockdowns. And, we're in the UK, I'm in Wales in the UK, so we were locked down from midnight on Saturday, which I'm just convinced they wanted to bring that vibe down, ready for the 21st, or, yesterday. But this is what's driving them, is these false positives. What is it, in your opinion, that they're actually amplifying with that tool?
Well, it's really difficult to say, because one thing is that so the PCR is not a test. What it really is a manufacturing technology, because it can take very tiny amounts of DNA or RNA and turn them into really, really large amounts. Okay, like if we had a PCR that worked on objects, like we would be really wealthy, right? Like imagine you buy a new car and you take that and put it through this machine, and then,
make
you
two or
know, a few
more.
cycles later, you have 1,032 cars. Right? Because it works by doubling. So each round of the PCR manufacturing, you double the number of things. So like if you start with one, right, then you have two, and then you have four after 2 rounds, and it seems like you're not making that much progress. But, you know, then it goes up quickly because, you know, it goes from 4 to 8 to 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. You see right now, we're gonna, when we get to 1,028, then it's gonna go instantly to 2,000. So the more of these cycles you do, you end up with really, really huge numbers. And it's not, each time it uses this enzyme called attack polymerase, and it's a special thing that it causes the DNA to make a copy of itself, but it does it only at a certain temperature. So they put it to the right temperature, it copies, then they change the temperature and it turns off.
Right.
And that's how each cycle they do that, so it doubles each time. Now, one thing is that enzyme actually makes mistakes. It's not perfect. Okay.
Right.
And there's a lot of imperfections in there. So when you get up to the big numbers of amplification, you end up just seeing background noise.
Right, I get
And
it. Yeah.
like the inventor of the test said that, you know, if you crank up enough amplification that you could see any sequence that exists in the world, right? And that's one of the things that they're doing to get positive tests. So it's widely accepted that if you go more than 35 times or 30 times by most people of doubling, right? Those are called cycles or cycle threshold. They'll use all these fancy words to confuse you. That if you go more than 30 or 35, you're just basically showing noise, junk, like not something that's really there.
Yeah.
And in the UK, they use 45. So they use 10 more cycles than the maximum. So that ensures that basically a lot of the positives are just junk. They're totally meaningless. Like it's not a real, it doesn't show a sequence of anything.
No, it doesn't. And that's the problem that they've got, because most of the people who are testing positive are asymptomatic, but they're being tested because they've had to for their job.
Right.
They've voluntarily gone and had a
Yes.
test, and you know, it's causing all sorts of problems.
Right.
And, you know,
so the people who are agreeing to do those tests, they're actually causing this problem. Like they may not realize it, and that's why I'm saying it. It's very important to know, because every time you submit to a test, not only are you putting yourself in harm's way, and I can explain that in a moment, but you're actually driving the lockdown policies and the curfews and all of the restrictions. If you simply just say, no, thank you, then they can't report cases because people aren't actually sick.
Exactly.
But even if people are symptomatic, still a test is meaningless.
Yeah.
It's still measuring junk, right? It doesn't correlate with any cause of an illness. The person just happens to be ill the same way that they were in 2019 or 2018 or 2017. And if there is anything new in any particular area, which there could be, it's most likely related to some kind of environmental change, like some kind of pollution, or, you know, new product, or, you know, etc., things like that, or new technology or new vaccine. You know, those are the things that would cause new presentations. And that's, you know, we've really seen that over the last century. We've seen a great expansion in the number of new diseases. And notice how none of these new diseases have any explanation of what causes them. And this is really, most of them are caused by vaccines.
Absolutely. This is, you know, even cancer skyrocketed after the onset of mass vaccination. But even so, you just talking about the illness that we're seeing today, and the chronic disease that we are seeing. Even when I was a youngster, I don't even remember, and I'm 37, so, you know, when I was a child, I don't remember hearing about anyone who had Alzheimer's, for example. And yet now, here I am 3 decades later with it appearing, and not only appearing in huge numbers, but in younger and younger
Yes.
people. Can you explain from your point of view, doctor, what that could be in relation
Right.
to vaccines?
Well, the disease areas that have the strongest association to vaccines and that also respond to natural healing strategies that would basically be related to metal detoxification and things like that are in I would say kind of three general areas, which is the neurologic diseases, the autoimmune diseases, and cancer. And so the neurologic diseases, you see many children with issues like encephalopathy, encephalitis. Sometimes those things are fatal, and a lot of autism and other neurodevelopmental related issues, and perhaps some anxiety and mood related issues as well. But then you see all this neurodegenerative disease, and you're right, it does seem to occur in younger and younger people, and the prevalence incidence is increasing substantially, which is, things like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, and Alzheimer's and other dementias. So absolutely, that there's a big causal relationship, and those things were, just practically non-existent in the past. And, some things like autism were non-existent in the past. And there's, that's well documented in the historical and scientific record.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, in Africa with Bill Gates, he took autism to Africa with his vaccination programs. They're huge, and he has such a huge impact and influence on this whole thing. It's quite frightening, really. But you're right, the vaccines are causing something like I'd never, looking historically, and we may have had some, diseases back then, but our living conditions, everything was different. Lack of nutrition, lack of poor sanitation, poor living conditions. There are so many contributing factors to how disease arises anyway, but then when I often wonder if they hadn't have brought in vaccines when they did, what type of world we'd be living in, if I'm honest, doctor, with all of the things that I see arising from it is shocking.
Well, Catherine, I think, one really interesting thing to look at would be the research of Weston A. Price, who was, a dentist and, maybe a forensic odontologist. At least he did that kind of research. And so, and he was alive a while ago, but he did this really interesting research looking at the dental fossil records, okay, like skulls and jaws and teeth of people around the world from pre-industrial times. Compared to industrial times, and noticing the difference. And the main difference was nutrition changed substantially with the Industrial Revolution, because for the first time you have like large-scale manufacturing of food and agriculture. And so prior to that, what he found in almost every culture, and even, without having toothbrushes and fluoride and dentists, okay, we're talking about like in indigenous peoples too, like Aboriginals and other places, that people had bigger jaws. So in other words, they could accommodate all their teeth, including the wisdom teeth. And that was another thing, that people's wisdom teeth grew in. They didn't have to get them removed like, we almost all do now.
I've often wondered that, just to stop you there, doctor. I was talking about this the other day, because I've still got my wisdom teeth. They come through maybe once every 8 years to give me a little bit of, but then they settle down. And I often wondered, why were we born with these teeth if they're supposed to be removed? So you're going to tell me.
Well, no, I mean, of course, our bodies are designed very carefully. We're supposed to have everything that we have, right? And I know that medicine sometimes tells us certain things are expendable, like your appendix and your gallbladder and your tonsils.
But it's there for a reason, right? It's there for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. All these things are there for a reason, even our wisdom teeth. And so this line of research really uncovered, that proof that, okay, they were meant to be there and they did fit, and it's the same thing with the rest of your mouth, because why are people's teeth crooked? it's because the jaw is not big enough, right? And people have crowding in their mouths. This is almost always the case.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, they actually pull teeth out and then they use braces to straighten. But looking at these people pre-industrial revolution, what was found was that they had straight teeth and they didn't have orthodontists, you know? And it's because they had enough room to accommodate all the teeth, so they grew in straight. And interestingly, there were only a couple of isolated areas where he found people with tooth decay, and it was areas where they had some kind of really sweet fruit in abundance that they ate in abundance, and that caused tooth decay. But these were, you know, very isolated areas. Virtually everywhere else, not the case, like no substantial tooth decay.
Yeah.
So he was able to uncover that there were 3 nutritional factors that were missing in the modern diet that accounted for the difference. And he was able to know that 2 of them were vitamin A and vitamin D, but the third one was he was unable to determine at that time. But sometime around 20 years ago or so, new research uncovered that it was vitamin K2, which was previously not really known or classified as a vitamin. And it's involved in, you know, bone growth and regulation and remodeling. And you only get it from grass-fed animals or some fermented vegetables, but not things that you would have eaten in our culture, like natto, which is these foul-smelling fermented soybeans. But you know, from grass-fed butter and cream and meat, which would have been the traditional way that, you know, people would have eaten meat. Right? But then when they started raising animals in large-scale agriculture, they started feeding them corn and soy, right? Because those were cheaper. And then the animals don't have any K2 in their meat and dairy. So, you know, this is one of the things that becomes deficient.
Yeah. And there's been a big issue with, you know, how food has become over the last 100 years, well, especially sort of since the processed food industry kicked off. You know, you've got that sort of side of it as well, you know, it dependent on your environment then as well is important, and also the mind. But talking about this now, just while we're on this subject, it'd be a good idea to perhaps go into the terrain theory a little bit, and what are your views on the terrain theory, Béchamp?
Yeah, well, you know, the terrain theory is a contrasting theory to the germ theory, which, you know, in my opinion, there really has not been any empirical evidence that supports germ theory, and there's been a lot of medical industry based on it, but I don't feel that it's produced any meaningful outcomes, and that it's, you know, something that we should really toss aside. Now, terrain theory is something that actually we're all familiar with already because we know about the microbiome. And, you know, at least we acknowledge that there are microorganisms in our gut that are really helpful, in fact, absolutely necessary to our ability to thrive and even survive. And, you know, in mainstream experiments, it's even been shown that DNA sequences from bacteria that live in our gut are in our brain cells.
Wow.
Okay. So, you know, people say the gut-brain axis.
Yeah.
Right? They're really talking about these microorganisms. So these play a vital role, but they're not just present in our gut, they're actually present throughout our body.
Right.
And our body can call on them for various purposes to help with situations. And this is really terrain theory. So if you just take what you already are comfortable knowing about the gut microbiome and extend it out to its logical conclusion, you basically have terrain theory. Now, Béchamp, Antoine Béchamp, a French scientist, a very accomplished scientist who was sort of known as the nemesis to Louis Pasteur. And Pasteur actually plagiarized some of his work and copied some of his experiments and tried to take credit. But Béchamp was just basically, you know, hard at work, and he took things a lot further than what, you know, Pasteur did with his alleged germ theory experiments, and ended up discovering what he called microzymas, which is the basic of the pleomorphism theory related to terrain theory. And so what he noticed is basically that if animals were, killed but not exposed to any outside bacteria or microorganisms, they still decomposed, right? So they basically had bacteria inside them. Now we, already kind of know about this because they have the gut bacteria. But actually, he took this a step further and noticed that if you look under the right kind of microscope where you can observe living cells, that's called a dark field microscope. So you could look at like live blood and other cells under this while they're still living, and you could observe behavior. That he saw these small specks of light coming out of blood cells, and that these actually develop into various species of microorganisms. And he termed them microzyma. But other scientists who followed up on this research had different names, like somatids was one of the other names, and protids was yet another name. And but basically, these are like the stem cells, if you will, for microorganisms, and they come out of our own cells. And so, in the terrain theory, how you'd understand an illness would be that you would have some acute insult, right, that damages tissue somewhere in your body. So this could be like from a toxic material. It could be from a nutritional deficiency, right? And something damages the tissue, like even like a blood clot blocking the blood flow, like what a heart attack is, right? Then it damages the tissue of the heart. So that's the acute phase of the illness. And then your body calls on these particles, these microzyma, to develop into just the right species of bacteria or fungus to go to that site where the injury occurred and clean it up. Because there'll be damaged tissue, there'll be debris, right? Basically, bacteria are the cleanup crew in nature, right? We've all observed this, like if we have a compost pile, right? Your compost is taking the waste and cleaning it up, turning it back into nutrients that can feed more plants. And that's exactly what's happening in your body. So, so you inhale, toxic materials over the course of a year. They get stuck in the little cilia and other parts in your respiratory system. And then when cold and flu season come, the environmental cue of decreased humidity and temperature trigger your body to clean out all that stuff, right? So it calls in the cleanup crew. So bacteria come and they, eat up the toxins and the debris, and they make waste too when they do this, right? And their waste makes you have symptoms. Yeah. So it causes the swelling and the secretions, like all the snot and phlegm, and, coughing and sneezing. And that actually helps your body get rid of the waste products, right, from the tissue damage. So it's helpful in the healing process.
Yeah. But people
right?
often, misinterpret, and again, it boils down to the germ theory, but misinterpret those symptoms as being the actual disease.
Right.
But in reality,
Yes.
it's your cure from the disease.
Yes.
And our bodies are absolutely remarkably complicated, but quite simple. I think that it repels the mind to most people that would even be the case. But
Right.
in my case, I think we all subconsciously know that, eating poorly, eating bad food will make us ill. There is a subconscious feeling from most people. There's just no connection there because of the germ theory is so heavily used in the medical industry for,
That's right.
And actually without the germ theory, the vaccine industry especially would fall flat on its face.
Well, there are many things that could collapse the vaccine industry, but certainly if germ theory is false, which I believe it is, then there's no basis for vaccine-related immunity. But also, if the immunity from liability for vaccine manufacturers was repealed, then also vaccines would collapse because manufacturers would not be able to stay in business with all the people suing them after they're injured or dead.
Well, that's how it started in the first place, wasn't it? Because they couldn't keep, because they were liable at one point, pre-1986, they were liable, went to Congress, they were paying too much money out in lawsuits. So then they brought in the Vaccine Injury Act in 1986. And then this is when they obviously take no light. And I don't think many people are even, although I've been shouting it for a long time, I don't think people really understand how this works in terms of, I think they're the only, other than nuclear war and acts of God, the only industry that you can't get insurance for, I guess, or you can't. It's ridiculous, and that should be a huge red flag actually in people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. But the truth of the matter is that people don't investigate these things at all. They just rely, on the mainstream media, and the mainstream media is funded by the vaccine industry. They're one of their largest advertisers. So they're never going to tell you the truth about these things. And, it's up to you really to find out on your own. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you were a businessman or an attorney and you had a keen understanding of what immunity from liability meant in terms of how you could operate, and you knew this was true about vaccines, well, you would instantly be extremely skeptical
Oh,
and say,
absolutely.
whoa, 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 what, you're asking me to do what? Right? What, whoa, wait a second, because essentially you're giving the business a license to take any shortcut for safety that they want that's going to increase their bottom line because they don't have to worry about it. So if they accidentally, put 10 times as much mercury in 100,000 vaccines, and then they discover it in their quality control, but it would cost them, let's say $1 million if they had to throw those away, and they would make $10 million if they sold them, and they couldn't get sued, so they would just sell them, right, and not tell anyone. And then those people who got injured from it, tough on them.
Yeah,
Right?
that's exactly.
It's like, and so you or I would never do that for profit, right? But we are not running pharmaceutical companies. And the people who are have shown time and time again that they will do things like this without, with impunity, really.
Yeah, and and even it's just since 1986, especially because I was born in 1983, so I had, I think, 10 doses of about 4 vaccines. But 1986, obviously, it's directly in line of when they were given that liability, is when the vaccine schedule started to rise very quickly. And so did autism rates, that they do go line in line, as well as other neurological damage. But in terms of them not taking in this new COVID vaccine, I mean, they're openly stating that they're not giving any results data, they're not testing it, they haven't tested it on pregnant women, they haven't tested it on those with medication, they haven't tested it for infertility. They're telling us here that, and they're also saying that, oh, they're not actually taking any liability either. They're telling us pretty much in the media here, and people are still very, very trusting of it. But what would you say about the COVID vaccine in terms of what you've seen so far, Dr. Kaufman?
Well, there's so many things to say, and you're right.
Yeah.
They do have immunity from liability, and by the way, so do the manufacturers of the testing kits.
Oh, I didn't
Uh,
know.
yes,
Right.
pretty
Sense.
much
Yeah.
any COVID-related product, it's a windfall for the industry because no liability for anyone. So you can make a test kit that doesn't even do what you say, and you're totally fine.
Crazy, right? It's absolutely crazy.
So with the vaccine, though, what you have is a situation where is no disease to even justify a vaccine. And then, of course, there's no virus to link to a disease. So, what is the vaccine? What's the purpose of it? It's not what is revealed. And of course, this is by far the fastest time for a vaccine to market that's ever occurred. There was one other rush of a vaccine that was 4 years. I think it was for mumps. That was the record before this, and this is 4 times faster. And it's a brand new technology. It doesn't work like any other vaccines. So there's more unknowns with it. And I think, you mentioned that many corners were cut, right? And that there's actually the safety testing is ongoing right now, even though the vaccine is authorized, not approved, authorized for emergency use. The initial study that had the data is ongoing. It's 2 years. So it's not even completed. But they did not do animal studies, which normally you do animal studies before you do human studies. And mostly, you're looking for toxicity. And when they tried to develop similar vaccines for SARS and MERS, in the animal studies, they were so toxic that they abandoned the vaccine technology. So here, they specifically skipped the animal trials, and that very likely would have shut the whole thing down if they had done them. So it's very strategic and very telling that they don't want a whiff of toxicity to. And then the trial design, like for the Pfizer, was that they didn't count any COVID symptoms in the vaccine group until after the second injection was given. But yet they had large numbers of people who developed COVID symptoms after the first injection, like almost like it caused the infection. But none of those were counted in the outcomes. So in other words, I mean, you could say a lot of things about that so-called 90% effective rate, but one of the things is it doesn't even count that. So it's inflated in many ways. Also, it's not really a true number because that's the relative risk reduction. So we're talking about a very, very small number of people in this trial, and they didn't even need to have symptoms. They could have just had a positive test. And it's saying that, this relative risk reduction is 95%, but that's, since there were only a small number of people in the trial that had a positive test at all, if you're most likely to be one of those people who don't have a positive test. So in that case, the vaccine would be of zero benefit to you. So it's not that like 95% of the people are going to be,
No, of course.
it's going to be effective for. If you look at it that way, then you calculate what's called the absolute risk reduction, and it's something like 0.8%. So in other words, for any average person, if you take the vaccine, you're 0.8% less likely to have severe symptoms of that illness if you get it, according to what they say. And because it only reduces the severity of the symptoms, so it doesn't prevent the illness, they say they don't know if it prevents the transmission. So even by stretching all of this data and fudging these procedures of how they do it, and also hiding the adverse events, which I'll get to in a second, they still can't demonstrate that it's really beneficial. And, this is why people like Fauci say that even after the vaccine, we still have to social distance, still have to wear masks, still have to lock down. So it won't actually change anything or return anything to normal. So why would you possibly take it? There's no benefit, tangible benefit from it. But on the other side, they have done a great deal to mask the the side effects or the adverse effects. And one trick that they use, and they do this in other vaccine studies, is that they don't give a true placebo. Instead, they give another vaccine or all of the ingredients from the vaccine except for the one piece of the virus or something. And so since most of the toxicity comes from those other, they call adjuvants, so they're not like inert ingredients that they add, like, a little bit of, salt, for example, that would be inert, that they would just use to buffer the solution or something. Like, these are things that they say are necessary for the vaccine to work. So they're actually active ingredients. So the idea of a placebo is that you separate the active ingredients out, and in the placebo, you have none of the active ingredients, right? So it should be basically an injection of saline or salt water. It shouldn't contain anything, but in this trial, they used the meningitis vaccine. So they had people die in both groups, actually. And, they only recruited healthy people to be in this trial. So these were not like sick people dying anyway that died. These were healthy people that died after getting a vaccine, and people died in both arms. And so they said, basically because of that, it's not from the vaccine, but actually it's from the vaccine in both arms because they both got vaccines.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, all the tricks like that, and, or like they had a meeting in October, the FDA and the CDC and all their, top people to talk about how they're going to monitor for adverse effects once the vaccine gets rolled out. And they give this list of all the things they expect. And it's just amazing. It's like, you know, everything that could kill you or cause lifelong disability, you know, things that were similar to multiple sclerosis, similar to polio, different ways you could get paralyzed or have meningitis or encephalitis, autoimmune disease, heart attacks, birth defects, and pregnancy complications, autoimmune disease, Kawasaki disease in children, you know, everything horrible. And they're like, that's what they expect to find, you know? So for no real benefit, and then the possibility of all these horrific
Huge
health
risk.
consequences, you know, it's not rational or logical to decide to get this vaccine if you actually look at the information.
Yeah, that's the thing is the, you know, and a lot of these are actually very similar to other vaccines in what they can actually do. And I think, you know, people have to realize that every time you take a vaccine, there is a very real risk of injury or death every single time you take one. You know, it's like playing a game of Russian roulette. And like you say, that there is no, to me anyway, over my years, there is absolutely no benefit to a vaccine based, you know, it's based on germ theory. But that aside, trying to poison something outside, trying to poison something that outside of your body, you know, trying to get rid of something in your body with another poison sounds ridiculous, you know, and to think that all of these, and it's huge, you know. I think VAERS, which is, you know, over where you are, I think it's something, is it not 1% of report? Because I saw that it's something like, and this would make sense, doctors underreport vaccine damage by something like 90%. That's quite a scary figure there. Would you agree with that?
Well, the Department of Health and Human Services in the US, who is like the department that the CDC is part of, they funded Harvard professors, researchers to look at the VAERS database, which is the voluntary reporting system in the United States for, you know, injuries from vaccines. And they concluded, after looking at their large health system, that the VAERS database contains less than 1% of the actual vaccine-related injuries and deaths. And at that point, the HHS actually shut down the research. And so they never followed it up or had a scientific publication. But, you know, if you extrapolated what's in VAERS to, you know, times 100, you find huge, huge numbers. But the thing is, it's like most doctors, like I went to medical school and I did pediatrics rotations, and, you know, where vaccines was emphasized as something we had to learn about and follow up on. And I was never told about the VAERS database. I was never told about side effects from vaccines at all, other than, you know, pain at the injection site and maybe a mild fever, you know, that day, right? Other than that, not told anything about Guillain-Barré syndrome or autoimmune disease, or not even told what's in the vaccine, that there are heavy metals in there and polysorbate 80 and, you know, all kinds of other chemicals and DNA, foreign DNA and such. So, you know, really just a kind of a lack of education.
I think that's what the issue is with it, especially from my point of view, because, you know, I'm just a researcher. I've got a very good memory. I've been researching a long time, but in terms of any medical degree or qualification, then I don't have one. So it comes into that, and I did too, you know, before this, is that blind assumption that your doctor has done all there is to know about vaccines. You know, they must have done it in med school, and it's actually such a misconception, isn't it? As you've just explained, you know, it comes down from yourselves being sort of, you just assume again that everything is right and safe, and you know, it's only when
they don't even you know, they don't even teach us that, like show us the actual data that proves that vaccines are effective.
Wow.
Because there is none. Like if you look for that, you'll find, that one, there are no randomized controlled trials. They're not even required usually to get vaccines approved. And then, so that would be the most scientific way to tell if vaccines were effective. There's also, by the way, no long-term studies of safety or adverse events.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and even though there's a legal obligation for those to be conducted, it hasn't been done, and the government's been sued for not doing that successfully, and they're still not doing it.
Crazy.
So it's really, it's really interesting. So you have no randomized controlled trials, so all you have is epidemiologic evidence. So in other words, you could look at how many cases are reported in a year, and then you can look at when vaccines were invented and then when vaccines were actually administered to the population. Because, a vaccine like this is unprecedented with the COVID vaccine, but in the past, a new vaccine comes out, and then it takes several years before a significant percentage of the population gets it. It doesn't happen right away. So if you look at that data, what you'll see is for all of these big diseases related to vaccines, even chickenpox, this is true for. I mean, every single one that I've looked at, you'll see that the disease essentially started dropping down, and in some cases completely went away before the vaccine was available or widely distributed. So if the vaccine, if the disease went away before the vaccine was available, then the vaccine couldn't have caused it to go away. Exactly. And that's what you see in every case. So there's no evidence that the vaccines have accomplished their purported benefit is. So you really don't have to go any further to make a decision about vaccines. But if you do go further, you should really be running away from them. Because you'll see the amount of injury and disease, that they've caused.
Well, that's just it, and I've been doing this 11 years, and I've met thousands of people who have gone away and researched, and I have not one person that has researched vaccines independently. Not one of them I know has ever gone back to vaccinating. I mean, that's got to sort of, for the other people out there sat on the fence, maybe, has got to, sort of think, hang on a minute, why is this anti-vaccine movement so huge, and why did Boris Johnson want to spend 130 million pound of the taxpayers' money on shutting people like us up?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's it's really pretty astonishing, but you're absolutely right. I've never met anyone who researched vaccines and became a proponent of them.
Yeah.
Not once has that ever occurred. And that's a great way to look at issues, because, anything that's like that, people research and always, get to the same conclusion by actually seeing the information, then that's a really strong, validation of the truth.
Yeah. Just before we go then, Dr. Kaufman, just as a psychiatrist, I thought I'd ask you this question, because at the moment we're experiencing the most psychological warfare on a degree I've never seen or researched in the past. This time is taking it. What do you think the effects are going to be unless we can turn this around quite quickly, long term on children, well, on us all, Yeah,
well, we've already seen quite a number of effects. If you just look at suicide rates, for example, and nothing else, that can be very much taken as a measure of the psychological effect, not of a real new illness, but of the climate of fear that was purposely orchestrated right through public relations campaign and media, and then disrupting people's livelihoods and restricting their freedoms. I mean, essentially, this will ruin the human spirit. And I think one of the most important aspects is social isolation, right? Separating people from each other, creating a culture where you're afraid of your fellow man because they will get you sick or kill your grandmother, right? Or be a threat to your existence, rather than the natural relationship between humans, which is, that of cooperation, community, affection, right? I mean, we are social beings. We need to be around each other. We need the human touch. We
Yeah.
need eye contact. We need to see smiling faces. And without witnessing or being, devoid and deficient in these elements, we become, empty and change. And I think when you see children developing in this type of social culture, they are not going to know really how to form appropriate, intimate human relationships because they're not going to have the experience. They're not going to see people's identity. They're going to have problems with their own identity, knowing who and what they are, right? And they are going to have problems with communication, both emotional and language, because when faces are covered up, you miss important cues to language, to recognition, to emotional expression and perception, that a whole generation is right now, month after month. I mean, this is not 2 weeks, right? We're going on a year,
Yeah.
that our children have, we've affected their development in a negative way already by going along with this.
Yeah.
And I personally spend a lot of my effort trying to compensate for that, but there's only so much I can do, because I can't organize big groups of kids because too many of the parents are afraid of violating the rules, that there's no, like, the artistic expression is one thing that's suffering a big time, because we can't, and my kids are really involved in this, but there's no creative group activities. There's no concerts like this holiday time, right? At my kids' school, they have this big peace celebration, and it's like they talk about rituals and traditions from all over the world, and there are performances. And last year my son and I did a saxophone duet, and I mean, it's like, this is a great experience for expression and community. And they, like, so my kids are not at the school anymore because of the policies, but I know that they had this on, in a virtual ceremony this year, where everyone is doing like what we're doing right now. And
Yeah.
that's just no substitute.
I
But
know.
I feel like the globalist regime, it wants us to have that as our primary social interaction, being virtual.
They're definitely
That,
pushing it.
that's all that will be safe. And this is, will be really the end of human existence, and will become, transhuman in some way,
And
beyond human.
that's what it's doing, is taking away everything it is to be human, and even with our energy and our energetic field, we need to, like you say, we're social beings, we need to be around, and it's cutting off the soul and cutting this. It's quite sad, but
Right. Well,
I
Catherine,
believe that
that's a
positive.
really excellent point, because the magnetic field of the human heart extends 6 feet,
Yeah.
right? That's the exact dimension that we're told to stay away from each other, right? Just beyond reach of our heart fields,
Yeah.
right? So this, I mean, I think it's important to look at it in this more spiritual, energetic, and esoteric way as well, because a lot of this can be interpreted really as ritual in that realm, such as the mask and the initiation ritual.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. But I do think, I hope I've got hope for humanity, and I think the things you're doing, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Kaufman. I really can't. I'm so glad you said yes and gave me the opportunity to interview you today, because people are going to absolutely love to watch you, and I really thank you for everything you're doing. And I would love to speak with you again, maybe in a few months when things have passed on, and
Yeah,
see where we
absolutely,
are.
Catherine. It was pretty evident that you were, serious, and that you had done your homework. And, anyone who puts in the time to get out truthful information, I definitely want to, work with. So I'm glad that you reached out to me and we had this opportunity. And I'd be happy to check back in with you
Oh,
in
great.
time.
Thank you so, so much, and have a lovely Christmas. And hopefully next year we'll be in a little bit of a better position.
Yes, I hope for that as well. And everyone out there, please enjoy your holidays, and express gratitude for what you do have and the people around you who are willing to be close and spend that time together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Take care, Dr. Kaufman. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.